When Jesus entered the temple, the chief priests and the elders of the people came to him as he was teaching and said, "By what authority are you doing these things? And who gave you this authority?" Jesus said to them, "I will also ask you one question. If you tell me the answer, then I will also tell you by what authority I do these things. Did the baptism of John come from heaven, or was it of human origin?" And they argued with one another. "If we say from heaven, he will say to us, 'Why then did you not believe him?' But if we say of human origin, we are afraid of the crowd, for all regard John as a prophet." So they answered Jesus, "We do not know." And he said to them, "Neither will I tell you by what authority I am doing these things. What do you think? A man had 2 sons. He went to the first and said, 'Son, go and work in the vineyard today.' He answered, 'I will not.' But later he changed his mind and went. The father went to the second and said the same, and he answered, 'I go, sir,' but he did not go. Which of the 2 did the will of his father?" They said, "The first." Jesus said to them, "Truly I tell you, the tax collectors and the prostitutes are going into the kingdom of God ahead of you. For John came to you in the way of righteousness, and you did not believe him. But the tax collectors and the prostitutes believed him. And even after you saw it, you did not change your minds and believe him." This is the gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord. And let us pray. Gracious Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of each heart here be acceptable in your sight, our strength and our redeemer. Amen. Well, you are in an exciting time as a congregation, but it can also be a scary time, because you have the opportunity right now to really look at what you do and ask yourselves why you're doing it, and reevaluate if what you have always done is in alignment with God's will. God wants you to make disciples. The purpose of the church is to make disciples. That's what Jesus charged us with. And so do the practices that we engage in today. Make disciples. Today in the church, and I mean the whole church, not just this congregation, but certainly including this congregation, we are still extremely concerned about authority. Who decides what? Who has control? Who has the right to make decisions? By what authority are you doing these things? And who gave you this authority? That was the question that was directed at Jesus by the chief priests and the scribes. Who told you to do these things and say these things? And what gives you the right? In the end, it comes down to belief. Where do you get your information about God? And what is reliable information about God? What do you believe? And what do you build that belief on? Who do you listen to? And why should we listen to Jesus? Especially as we get further into the Gospel of Matthew and we get closer to the cross. The challenge that the chief priests and elders level against Jesus is not, "Jesus, we believe you're a fake." They say, "Jesus, we believe that you're a bad authority. You're leading people astray, and you might even be doing the work of the devil." Several years ago, I had a chance to listen to a speaker by the name of Jay Baker. And Jay Baker is kind of a scary-looking guy to me. He looks very different than the people I usually hang around with. He has tattoos all over his body. He's a recovering drug addict and alcoholic. He openly admits that he's a mess because he suffers from dyslexia, obsessive-compulsive disorder, depression, and panic attacks. So why would I spend precious time listening to him? Well, I listened to him because despite his life experiences, or maybe it is because of his life experiences, Jay is a deep-thinking theologian. He doesn't accept things simply because it's the way it's always been. And that's something that I always find it very easy to do. So I need to hear voices like those of Jay Baker in order to help me to see things in a different light. Now, one of the things he said was that we always say Jesus was sinless, but to the people of his day, he was doing things that people considered sin. He was an outsider of the mainstream. He was doing things that made the people in the temple raise their eyebrows. He made them afraid because he was challenging things that they held dear to their hearts, and he said shocking things, and he did shocking things. He broke down walls and built bridges, letting people cross over who had no business being in the company of good and upright and respectable people. You know, I sometimes wonder how we would react if Jesus showed up in our midst. When someone outside of the mainstream, someone like Jay Baker, he shows up looking just a little scary, doing and saying things that shock us, how do we react? And do we listen? You know, in some ways, people like Jay Baker are the John of our age. The prophetic wild one who shows up and starts spouting wild ideas, who starts saying out loud things that we'd like to keep in the shadows, the things that we're afraid to consider. Is there a place for prophets in our modern church? And do we believe them when they speak, or do we cringe away from them because they're too different and too radical? Or maybe we don't listen to them because they are doing things that we consider to be a sin. Just like the chief priests with Jesus. Jesus has just pointed out that religious authority looks prophetic. It looks like people like John. Now, his point being that what may look like religious vitality to us who are on the inside can really be an empty shell. Baker pointed out that we don't approach discipleship as Jesus did. And Jesus didn't say, you know, I was standing on this hillside preaching to hundreds, and now all I've got is 12. I think we need to sit down and relook at our vision and mission statement. Let's regroup. Let's get some iPads, and then we can give them away for free. Let's revamp our worship service and really pull people back in. The model of come and see our stuff doesn't work anymore. And I'm sorry to tell you, even the call a really dynamic pastor in the church will grow model does not work anymore. My family and I have been without a church home for a year and a half. And like vagabonds, we've rattled around going to various churches, feeling homeless and disconnected. And it hasn't always been comfortable, but it has taught us a lot about what attracts us to a congregation. And it's taught us how easy it is for people to just not come to church, even lifelong committed attenders. For many, the church isn't even one of the options they consider when they think about how they're going to spend their time. So if we sit here and wait for them to come, it most likely will never happen. The church is here to strengthen us to go out there. Jesus came to the temple, but most of his ministry happened outside of the temple when he was talking to people, meeting them where they lived and worked. Now, don't get me wrong, the church is important. Where else do we go to hear the call of Christ? Where else do we go to hear again and again the love that God has for each and every one of us? But Jesus calls us here in order to send us out into the fields. We are called to do what Jesus did, to go out and meet people where they're at, to talk to people, not for the purpose of winning them over or getting them to come into this place, but simply for the purpose of loving them, walking with them in their sins, hearing their stories, sitting at their tables and sharing God's love and grace with them, right where they're at. To someone on the outside, churches look kind of scary. They look at our buildings and they're often old and they have odd things inside. And even if they get beyond that and they have enough curiosity to take a peek inside, they hear songs that have words about things that they have never heard before. And the pastor talks about eating and drinking the body and blood of Christ, which when you think about it is kind of creepy. You know, they hear language that is totally outside of their experience, sanctified by the Lord, liturgy, covenant, even words like testament or gospel, fellowship or potluck. You know, the music isn't anything like what they listen to in their cars. And when they go to some churches, they are told that they shouldn't doubt or question, but just believe. Now, if a car salesman told them that, they'd be out the door in a second. So what do? You know, do we throw everything out? We love our buildings. We love our traditions. Well, the good news is, I don't think the problem is so much our buildings as the fact that we allow them to trap us inside. The problem is not so much our traditions as our rigidity. The problem is we stay huddled inside our churches with this message that needs to be out there, that everyone needs to hear, that they are accepted, that they are loved, that they are worthy, not because of anything that they do or don't do, but because they are God's. They won't hear that from anyone else. And oh, how they need to hear it. Everywhere else they go, even some churches that they go to, everywhere else they go, they are told that they have to first measure up, that they have to produce and succeed in order to be worthy and acceptable and worth something. And more often than not, all but those at the top are told that they don't measure up. And that is the message they get day in and day out. Perhaps the reality is that Baker was not called to provoke us, but to convict us. I think if we're honest, we'll admit that we're often closely aligned with the chief priests and their way of doing things. Clinging to our love of structure and tradition and to what we think is good and right and honorable, which too often slides into rigidity and judgmentalism and negativity against others. The very things that those who don't attend church accuse church-going people of. We need to continually ask the question, what is getting between us and our ability to share the gospel message with others? And if we're clinging to things that keep people from knowing the love of God, we need to let them go. The temple is a pretty comfortable place to be. And personally, I like it just the way it is. Asking these questions and trusting Jesus to know what he's up to can be very scary, and it can take a lot of hard work and conversation sometimes to figure out what it is that Jesus wants of us. But who is the authority here? Who do we listen to? If we find the courage to answer Jesus to that question, and then really seek to live it, I suspect that we will experience a depth of faith that is lacking when we simply do things just because we've always done them. And we will experience a depth of purpose that will truly give meaning to life. We are called and given this gift of faith for a reason. When you think about it, neither son in our gospel lesson fully does the will of the Father. One answered yes and didn't go. The other answered no and then did go. Well, I think that we should consider choosing the third option and answer a resounding yes to the call. And then let's go out into the fields and joyfully do the will of our Father by sharing in our words and in our actions this incredible gospel message that we've been blessed to know, this incredible gospel message that Jesus wants everyone to know, this incredible gospel message that we have to give as a gift to those who desperately need to hear it. So let us answer yes and go into the fields and do the Father's will. Thanks be to God.